Okay, so you want to own a Roman bathhouse. You are picturing marble. You are picturing steam rising off a heated pool the length of a swimming lane, sunlight coming down through high windows, 300 citizens a day handing you a coin at the door on their way to the warmth. A machine that the entire city needs every single afternoon, whether there's a war on or not. People will die without wheat. They will riot without games, but they will genuinely feel they cannot live without your baths, and they will tell you so. Now, here is the coin they hand you at that door. In the city of Rome, a man paid 1 quadrans to get in. The quadrans was the smallest piece of bronze the mint bothered to strike, a quarter of an oaz. If an ordinary laborer earned a denarius for a full day breaking his back, the price of your baths was about 1/64th of that day's wage. It was the coin you'd flick at a street vendor and not wait for change. So sit with that for a second, because it's the whole problem in one image. The most beloved, most essential, most crowded building in the Roman city charged an entry fee so small it was almost a joke. And you were about to pour a fortune into wood, water, marble, and slaves to keep it running. The question this whole thing turns on is simple. If the door barely brings in the price of a snack, where on earth is the money? Because somebody got very rich off Roman bathing. It just wasn't always the person you'd expect, and it was almost never the person standing at the door taking the coins. Let's open one and find out. First thing you have to understand before you spend a single ace: there is no such thing as a Roman bathhouse. There are two completely different animals wearing almost the same name, and confusing them is how you go broke. The Romans had Balnea and they had Thermae. The historians still argue about the exact dividing line, and honestly, the Romans themselves were sloppy about it. The same building in the city gets called both in different sources, but the useful version is this: a balneum is a bathhouse, small, private, often crammed into a city block, built by somebody to make money. A thermae is a monument, vast, imperial, wrapped in colored marble, with libraries and running tracks and gardens, built by an emperor or a very rich man to be remembered. Here's the scale of it in hard numbers. In the year 33 BC, Agrippa ran a census of the baths in Rome and counted 170 of them. By the 4th century, the city's own official registers list 856. 856 bathing establishments in one city. And of those, only about 11 were the giant imperial Thermae. The other 840-something were Balnea, the small commercial baths. Yours is going to be one of those. So keep the two apart in your head, because they are not competitors in the ordinary sense. They are a corner shop and a national institution that happens to give its product away for free. And you are opening the corner shop directly downwind of the institution. Remember that. We come back to it, and when we do, it's going to hurt. Let's go back to that tiny coin at the door, because it deserves a proper look. The fee even had a name: the balneaticum. At Rome, the standard rate for a man was the quadrans. Women generally paid more, perhaps double, which sounds backwards until you realize the women's section was usually smaller and ran on separate hours. So you were charging more for a scarcer, more awkward slot. Children paid nothing. And the bather brought his own kit, his own oil, his own towels, his own bronze strigil to scrape the sweat and dirt off his skin. You didn't even have to supply that. Now think about what that price actually tells you. A price that low is not set by a market. Nobody arrives at a quarter of the smallest coin we make by calculating costs and adding a margin. That price is set by custom and by politics. Bathing had become something a Roman simply expected to be able to do, cheaply, every day, the way we expect tap water. The moment your fee climbs high enough that a poor man notices it, you're not running a business anymore. You're a target for the mob and an embarrassment to whichever politician wants their vote. So here's the trap you have just walked into, and you walked into it before you laid a single brick. Your revenue per customer is fixed at almost nothing, and it is fixed by forces that have nothing to do with your costs. You cannot raise it. Meanwhile, everything it costs you to open the doors, the wood, the water, the wages, the marble that cracks, and the pipes that fur up, all of that answers to no such rule. Your income is capped by custom. Your costs are capped by nothing. That is the shape of the entire industry. Hold it in your mind, because everything from here on is just watching that gap get wider. You want to know what running one of these actually obligated you to do? We are extraordinarily lucky because one contract survived. Not a poem about baths, not a moralist complaining about baths, an actual operating contract cast in bronze. It comes from a place called Vipasca, a Roman mining settlement in what is now Aljustrel in southern Portugal. The imperial administration owned the bathhouse there the way it owned most things in a mining town. And rather than run it themselves, they leased it out. They handed the bath to a private operator called a conductor who paid the treasury a fixed rent for the privilege of running it and kept whatever he could make on top. That single arrangement, owner takes a fixed rent, operator takes the risk, is the beating heart of this whole business, and we'll come back to why in a bit. The bronze tablet spells out exactly what that operator signed up for, and it is a beautiful, terrifying little document. The men paid half an as to bathe. The women paid a full as, again more, not less. The women had the baths from daybreak until the 7th hour of the day. The men got them from the 8th hour until the 2nd hour of the night, and then come the operator's duties. And this is the part that should make you sweat. He had to keep the bath properly heated and the water hot. He had to keep it open, on time, every day. He had to keep the fittings maintained. He had to let certain people, imperial officials, the procurator's household, bathe for free. And he had to do all of this whether 10 people showed up or 1,000. Read that clause about heat one more time, slowly, because it is the clause that kills you. Keep it heated, not heat it when it's busy, not light the furnaces when the crowd justifies it, keep it hot. Which means on a freezing, empty Tuesday in February when 4 people wander in, your furnaces are roaring exactly as hard as they roar on a packed festival afternoon, and you are burning exactly the same mountain of wood to warm water for a near-empty room. You have signed a contract to run a fire that never goes out, in a building where the customers are optional but the flames are not. So let's go down the stairs, underneath the beautiful marble floor, into the part of the bathhouse the customers never saw, because this, not the pretty pool upstairs, is where your money actually lives and dies. Roman baths were heated by a system called the hypocaust. The floor of the hot room sat raised up on hundreds of little brick pillars, leaving an open cavity underneath, and hot air and smoke from a furnace was drawn through that cavity and then up through hollow tiles inside the walls. The whole floor and the whole wall became, in effect, a radiator. It's genuinely brilliant engineering. The Romans were running central heating at civic scale 17 centuries before the rest of us managed it, and it ate wood the way a war eats men. We have the numbers for the monsters. The Baths of Caracalla, the grandest of the grand, ran on somewhere around 50 separate furnaces, fed through underground service tunnels wide enough to drive a cart through and stoked by hundreds of slaves in shifts around the clock. Modern estimates put its fuel use at roughly 10 tons of wood, not per week, per day. 10 tons of wood a day, forever, just to keep the water hot and the floors warm. Keeping that supply of wood coming was considered so critical that it became a matter of imperial responsibility. The emperor's problem, personally. Now, yours is a small commercial balneum, not Caracalla, but the physics doesn't scale down as kindly as you'd hope. Researchers looking at ordinary single baths have put the wood consumption at something like 114 tons a year for one modest establishment. 114 tons of firewood, bought, hauled, stored dry, and shoveled into the fire, year after year before you have paid a single wage or fixed a single cracked tile. Now put that against the door. Say you're a busy little bath and 300 people come through in a day, each paying a quarter of an os. That's 75 asses on the door. Call it 4 or 5 denarii for a good day's crowd. Do the arithmetic across a year and then set it next to 114 tons of wood, plus the men who cut it and cart it, plus the slaves who burn it, and you will see the horrible truth immediately. The door does not pay for the fire. It was never going to. The single biggest cost in your entire operation is a cost you carry every hour you're open, and the fee at the front can't come close to covering it, which means, mathematically, the bathing cannot be the business. The bathing is the thing that pulls the crowd in. The business has to be something else, and we are about to go find it. Before we do, one more cost that people always forget. because they assumed the aqueducts made water free. They did not make it free for you. Rome's water was extraordinary. Under Trajan, the aqueducts were pouring something on the order of 1,000,000 cubic meters a day into the city. But that water was not a public tap you could just plumb into. The right to draw running water off the aqueduct network was a grant, a privilege. In the case of the great public Thermae, the emperor might build an entire new branch aqueduct just to feed them. Caracalla's baths got their own dedicated line, splitting off the Aqua Marcia. For a private operator, a supply of live running water was a favor from the state, measured out and controlled. We know exactly how tightly it was controlled because a very senior Roman wrote a whole book about it. Around the year 97, a man named Frontinus was put in charge of Rome's water supply, and his report on the system survives. He documents how grants of water were assigned, how they were measured, down to standardized pipe sizes, and, most tellingly, how relentlessly people cheated. Illegal pipes tapped straight into the mains. Grants that outlived the person they'd been given to. Bribed workmen looking the other way. Frontinus is essentially describing a city where everyone is quietly stealing water, and the reason everyone is stealing water is that water is valuable and access to it is rationed. So your bath needs a permanent, licensed, live supply of one of the most tightly policed resources in the empire. And you need it flowing whether or not the customers turn up. Because a bath with cold, stagnant water isn't a bath, it's a hazard. Add it to the fire. Another cost that runs when the room is empty. Right. If the door can't carry the fire and the water, then the money has to come from what happens around the bathing. And here the sources open up beautifully because we have a witness, a grumpy, brilliant, sleep-deprived witness. The philosopher Seneca once had the misfortune to rent lodgings directly above a public bath, and he wrote a letter about the noise that is, accidentally, one of the best pieces of economic evidence we have, because listen to everything he can hear through the floor. He hears the grunt of men lifting weights and the wheeze as they drop them. He hears the slap of the masseur's hands working someone's shoulders. He hears the splashing of the men who cannonball into the plunge pool. He hears a man who insists on singing in the bath because he loves the sound of his own voice in the echo. And then he hears the sellers, the drinks man, the sausage man, the pastry man, the sweet cake man, each one crying his wares in his own distinctive shout so the customers can tell them apart without looking. And, unforgettably, he hears the hair plucker, the Ellipolus, whose entire job was removing armpit hair, advertising his service by making his victims yelp, a shrill cry going up over and over so everyone knows he's open for business. Now stop hearing that as noise and start hearing it as revenue. Every single sound in Seneca's letter is a transaction. The masseur is charging, the oiler is charging, the hair plucker is charging. The food and drink sellers are running a whole street market inside your walls. There is gambling in the corners. There is prostitution in the back rooms. The exercise ground before the bath is packed with people who will get hungry, thirsty, and vain, in that order. Your customer paid a quarter of an as to walk in the door, but the moment he's inside, he is inside a shopping center that you control the only entrance to, and he is warm, relaxed, undressed, and in the mood to spend. That is the actual product. The cheap door is the loss leader that fills the room. The room is where the wallets come open, and you need staff to run all of it. The capsari who guard the customer's clothes, and they matter because theft at the baths was so common, it became a stock joke. A Roman knew that leaving your tunic unguarded meant losing it. The fornicatores feeding the furnaces, the aquarii on the water, the masseurs and oilers and pluckers, most of them enslaved, which means they're not a wage line, they're a capital investment you had to buy up front and then feed in-house whether the baths are busy or not. Another fixed cost. Everything in this business is a fixed cost. That's the curse of it. Now we can finally answer the real question, and the answer is not the man taking coins at the door. The Romans looked down on the bath operator, the Balnea, the person who actually ran the place, collected the fee, and managed the fires, sat low in the social order. The satirists sneer at him. It was hot, greasy, servile work, and the margins, as we've just seen, were brutal. If you were dreaming of standing proudly at the door of your own baths, raking in the crowd's coins, understand that Romans thought that job was faintly disgraceful and it barely paid. So who did well? Follow the Vipasca model. Separate the owner from the operator. The person who owned the building did well because they didn't run it. They leased it out for a fixed rent and let some Balnea take on all the risk of the fire in the crowd. And we have a spectacular real example of exactly this. In Pompeii, a woman named Julia Felix owned a large property, and a surviving painted notice advertises it for lease. She's offering out her estate on a 5-year term, and the package includes an elegant bath fit for respectable clientele, along with shops and upstairs apartments. Julia Felix is not standing in the steam shoveling wood. Julia Felix is a landlord. She built or inherited a property with a bath in it, and she rents the whole bundle out and collects. She is on the right side of the deal. That's the first group who got rich. The property owners who converted a bath into rent and never touched a furnace. The second group is the concession holders, the people running that second economy inside. The food, the oil, the massage, the gambling. High-margin services with the crowd delivered to them for free by the cheap door. They don't carry the fire either. And then there's the third owner, the one operating at a completely different scale and playing a completely different game. And to understand that one, we have to talk about the giant free bathhouse standing where your customers can see it. Remember the 11 imperial Thermae, the marble monsters among the 800 small baths? Here's the thing about them that should terrify any private operator. They were, very often, free, or so close to free it made no difference. And they were magnificent. Why would an emperor build the most expensive, most beautiful bathing complex in the history of the world, capable of processing thousands of people a day, and then not charge them properly for it? Because he wasn't selling baths. He was buying something. This is the Roman institution the scholars call urgetism, public giving as a tool of power. A great man gives the people something magnificent, and in return he receives their gratitude, their loyalty, and their votes or their quiet. And baths were the perfect gift because everyone used them every day, and every day they'd be reminded whose name was carved over the door. Agrippa, back in the last century BC, gave the people free bathing and then built the first of the great public baths and left them to the city. When Faustus Sulla wanted to honor his dead father, he threw open the baths and gave out free oil. When Augustus came home from Germany, he treated the people to free baths and free barbers for a day. The oil alone was a serious gift. Remember, bathers had to supply their own, so handing out free oil was handing out real money. And at the top of the scale sits Caracalla. His baths burned 10 tons of wood a day, ran 50 furnaces, employed an army of slaves, and processed something like 6,000 to 8,000 citizens through cold plunges and steam rooms and libraries and gardens. And the state simply ate that colossal cost. Because what Caracalla got in return was his name on the single grandest amenity in the known world, free to every Roman who walked in. It never turned a cash profit. It was never meant to. The return was measured in loyalty, not coin. Now stand in your little commercial balneum and look across the city at that. You are trying to charge a quarter of an A's for a warm room. Half a mile away is a palace of colored marble with a heated swimming pool and a library, and it's free, paid for by the treasury of the empire specifically so that no one has to charge for it. That is your competition. You cannot win on price against something that costs nothing. You cannot win on grandeur against something the emperor personally subsidized. The third rich owner, the emperor, got the greatest return of anyone in this entire story. And he got it precisely by refusing to run it as a business at all. So could you, the private operator, actually make it work? Let's be honest about the arithmetic, and let's be honest about where the record runs out, because unlike some businesses, no Roman bathhouse left us a clean profit and loss ledger. What we can do is build the picture from the pieces that did survive. And I'll tell you when I'm reconstructing. A good year looks like this. The city is calm, the crowds are steady, the second economy is humming. Your door money is trivial as always, but the concessions are busy, the masseurs and food sellers are paying you well for their spots, and if you're smart, you don't even run the fires yourself. You're the landlord, like Julia Felix, taking a fixed rent off a Balnea who's carrying the risk. In a good year, the rent comes in clean and the building's value climbs. That's the winning hand. And notice, it's the hand where you're barely in the bathing business at all. A typical year is thinner than the fantasy promised. The door covers a sliver of the wood. The concessions and services carry the rest and leave you a modest margin. Enough to live decently, not enough to build a monument. You're solvent. You're respectable-ish. You are absolutely not the richest person in your town. A bad year is not simply a quiet year. This is the thing people misunderstand about a business built entirely on fixed costs. A bad year is when the crowd thins, but the fire cannot. There's unrest, or a bad harvest, or a rich man's new free baths open across the district and pull your crowd away, and your furnaces are still contractually, physically obligated to burn 10 hours a day at full heat for a half-empty room. Your wood bill doesn't fall. Your slaves still eat. Your water still runs. Every cost you have keeps running at full while the only income you have quietly drains away. You don't lose money slowly in a bad year. You lose it at exactly the rate you always spent it, with nothing coming in to replace it. That's the cruelty of the fixed cost business, then and now. It doesn't punish you for being idle. It punishes you for being open. Every institution in this story eventually died, and they died in a way that tells you exactly what the business really was. For centuries, the baths ran because the water ran and the wood arrived, and the state, or a rich man's vanity, kept the whole thing subsidized. And then, in the year 537, during the Gothic Wars, the besieging army cut the aqueducts feeding Rome. And that was quite simply the end. You cannot run a hypocaust and a set of heated pools on water you have to carry in by the bucket. The great baths went cold. The engineering that had warmed 1 million Romans a day became a cold marble ruin, and the ruins are what you queue up to photograph now. Notice how it ended. Not because people stopped wanting to bathe, they wanted it as much as ever. It ended because the thing propping it up was cut. The baths were never a self-sustaining business standing on its own 2 feet. They were an amenity balanced on top of a subsidy, the state's water, the emperor's wood money, the rich man's vanity. And the moment the prop was pulled, the whole beautiful, beloved, essential machine simply stopped. So, could you get rich owning a Roman bathhouse? Yes, but almost never by owning a bathhouse. You got rich by owning the building and renting it to some poor Balnea who took on the fire. You got rich by holding the food and the oil and the massage concessions and letting the cheap door deliver you a warm, undressed spending crowd. And if you were an emperor, you got the richest return of all, not in coins, but in a city that loved you, precisely by refusing to charge for it. The person who actually stood at the door taking the quadrans from each bather, feeding the endless fire, keeping the water hot on a freezing empty afternoon because a bronze tablet said he had to, that person the Romans looked down on, and the arithmetic explains why. He was the one holding the one part of the whole enterprise that never paid. You were never really buying a bathhouse. A bathhouse was the loss leader. What you were actually buying, if you were smart, was the door that every wallet in the city had to walk through, warm and relaxed and ready to spend, on the way to a pleasure it had already been promised for free. The bathing was the bait, the building was the asset, and the goodwill of a grateful city was worth more than every coin ever dropped at the door.